Hi there. Welcome back to 19th Century Art. This is the final 3 lectures for this class. We will be talking about the fin de siècle, the end of the century. And in this lecture, we're going to look specifically at the development of this movement that became known as symbolism. Now, in the background of all the art that is happening in and around the symbolist movement, we have to recognize Sigmund Freud and his ideas about dreams and the symbolic import of dreams and the psychological understanding of the way people live out these symbolic relationships in their own lives. And Sigmund Freud thought to himself on July 24, 1895, that he had this great revelation in a dream that he interpreted, of his own dream he interpreted, that this would one day become this important landmark, his home, where this all began. He did this a little bit tongue-in-cheek. The plaque actually does exist on that site today. And so when we talk about the fin de siècle, the end of the century, we're talking about a time that people felt a kind of impending crisis because this was the end of the 19th century. We were heading into the 20th century. And so there was this sense of foreboding and opportunity that was coming with what was really a pretty arbitrary shift in dates. But people started to think grandly about this turning that was happening in the world at large. And so one of the first movements, the Symbolist Manifesto, which was a literary movement, proposed that Romanticism didn't go far enough, that it was too involved in individual achievements and accomplishments and really didn't go into this idea of the world of symbolism. And so all kinds of ideas about evil, occult ideas, this way of rejecting rationalist thinking that was demanded by science, and that this naturalism and realism were too closely wed to this very limited idea about what the world really involved. Symbolism, in the strictest sense of the word, consisted of a close-knit literary circle with a manifesto and their desire to free themselves from rationalist thinking by science. So many 19th century artists rejected this idea of rationalism, that the world could be understood entirely through rational thought. And it spreads throughout Europe at the end of the 19th century. One of the artists who I've always found quite fascinating was Gustave Moreau, a French painter who was quite celebrated by the Art Academy. He brought this idea of mythology into his work in a very powerful way. He brought in some of the painterly qualities of the Impressionists along with this really solid grasp of classical antiquity, and he weds them together in this strange, symbolically ridden landscape. So here we have the Oedipus and the Sphinx. Now it's fascinating because Oedipus was one of the things that Freud talked a great deal about. The myth of Oedipus, this man who unknowingly murders his own father. Here we see in this encounter with the Sphinx this tacit understanding of the way this man is linked to his fate, lying there. And so there's a sense of a foreboding and power in the dark and gloomy skies. And Gustave Moreau was just a wonderful at capturing those tensions. He personally had a deep distrust of women, and he often frames the female as this destroying angel. You can see that also in the La Chimère, this dragging down this centaur, flying, this sense of tension between the male and the female. He did go on the grand tour. He was deeply connected to the classical past, and we can see the way he brings this dreamy quality to this neoclassical style. One of the stories that Gustave Moreau was deeply fascinated in was the story of Salome from the Bible, this evil temptress, destroying woman who decapitates John the Baptist. And we have these really powerful images in this symbolic way that this decapitation of John the Baptist is haunting over her existence is what makes it so sort of rich and exciting. He did 19 paintings and 6 watercolors and more than 150 drawings on this myth of Salome. And so clearly this was a very important foundational story for him. Here you can see close up the way he creates these wonderful jewel-like qualities, but also inside that richness, it also feels very ephemeral, just like it's a vision that's just coming into existence before it fades out, this dreamlike quality. He was deeply influenced by Hinduism at this time. In France, they had just colonized the mainland Southeast Asia, and they had discovered Angkor Wat, and images of Angkor Wat started to percolate into his work. You can see the way he inscribes the figure of Salome with these ornamental decorations. A lot of this kind of design work was derived directly from the pictures he saw from Angkor Wat from 1860. Now, the art movement that really embraced symbolism in a big way was the Nabis. The word Nabis means the prophets, and they tried to go at painting as if the artist is this magician, this seer, this prophet who has these visions that brings them back from the unknown into society. And society is pushed forward by these visions that artists create. Paul Cézanne worked closely with Paul Gauguin in the year 1888 when Gauguin was back in Paris. And Gauguin kept pushing him further and further into abstraction. Now, this rather small painting here was actually painted on the lid of a cigar box, was this talisman. This is what the Nabis said. This is our guiding light. This is this painting of this landscape that they started to really push away from trying to capture likenesses and allow the color and the rhythm and the shapes to become this new vocabulary for painting abstractly. Now, the symbolists were still interested in things and still interested in painting objects, but they did it in this way that they saw pure form as embodying the symbolic ideas. Here's Paul Cézanne in his self-portrait as a prophet, and they really did have these meetings where they would dress up in these costumes and these fancy magical amulets, and they would read from these magical books of theirs. And this was part of this mysticism that they were inventing that gave them this sense that what they were doing was connected to some kind of spiritual, mystical work. Other Nabis who were a part of this movement, maybe a little bit more grounded in the here and now. Pierre Bonnard was a tremendous painter who here we see in his self-portrait that wonderful loose touch of his where he breaks apart the surface of things and allows us to see and experience new connections in colors and forms. Bonnard would say, "It would bother me if my canvases were stretched onto a frame. I never know in advance what dimensions I'm going to choose." So he worked in a very loose, intuitive way. he seems to be discovering what is happening in the picture as he's painting it. And there's always a kind of visual trick, an idiosyncratic way in which we're looking at something and we're not quite sure how to make sense of it visually. So in this painting here, it's very curious the way the trunk of this slender tree comes down and then it's broken by a few leaves and then extends further beyond it. Is that the place where the tree goes in, or does it go down further, or is that a part of another plant? He's creating this visual play that allows us to both see and experience different dimensions simultaneously. Again, it's a visual trick, but the way he works in this very painterly way, it allows him to explore visual connections more readily than if he were rendering it in a fully realistic manner. Pierre Bonnard, like Toulouse-Lautrec, became fascinated by posters and poster art and was a part of that movement, creating many wonderful and dramatic compositions. Here, Le Revue Blanche, they have this picture of cabaret act, and he does this great use of silhouette. Again, we know that silhouette was a very important part of that post-impressionist movement. Bonnard was also often connected with Edouard Vuillard, who really did a lot more interior paintings. His mother and sister were seamstresses, and he spent a great deal of time in the interior, wallpapers, cloth, material, fabric. All of these things are richly explored in patterns and designs in the space. There's, again, this wonderful flatness in the richness of the textures of Vuillard's work. Here's another one, again, two seamstresses in the workroom. We can barely make out their form as the patterns and the designs are really richly overwhelming the picture. Perhaps one of the best known artists, Alphonse Mucha, who is closely associated with this art movement, Art Nouveau. Alphonse Mucha came in as a graphic designer quite by accident. In January 1894, a very important client comes into the design house where he's working. Everyone has gone away on holiday, and he is given this really important job of designing a poster for Sarah Bernhardt, who is the leading actress of her day. And so he throws himself into this job and he creates this image of Sarah Bernhardt performing, which is so extraordinary and so beautifully realized that Sarah Bernhardt immediately recognizes that this is her signature style. This is her signature look that she wants to promote herself as. And so she hires Alphonse Mucha to do all of her posters thereafter, and he becomes the leading light in this new Art Nouveau design, this visual play. It's heavily influenced by the Japanisme. The strong outline of the figure and the form is very clearly derived from this idea of the ukiyo-e print, patterns, decorations. It also brings in other kinds of archaic art forms. So it's at once this very modern and fresh look with very high design concept, but it's also this drawing back to antiquity and using forms that are medieval or from other cultures to bring this sense of archaic mystery to the composition. Here is another very famous painting of Sarah Bernhardt, and look at the way the treatment of his hair, this really extraordinary curls that become design in itself. The hair takes on a life of its own. The flowers seem to float off the face. There's just a brilliant way in which he uses this really striking outline to create a vibrant and dynamic composition. Of course, also he's very famous for his Job cigarette papers, a company that's still in business and still employs his designs. When you look at an Alphonse Mucha print, you're really transported into a kind of mystical reverie. Women, everything is beautiful and luscious and extravagant. And this was just part of the sense of wealth and opulence, at the same time drawing us back to antiquity, but not classical antiquity, other foreign places that are just outside our knowledge and awareness. Alphonse Mucha's design work came into Art Nouveau in many other different ways, and to create these environments that people were now reimagining. Ironwork for the staircase, this beautiful, heavily designed metropolitan subway entrance was made to people, encourage them to go down into the subway. It was kind of a terrifying thing to ride the subway when they were first being operated in Paris. So they had to create these environments that made it enticing, made it exotic and fun. There's actually one of these in Chicago. This is actually a photograph, one I took when I was in Paris. We can see that this loose, twisting ribbons of colors and forms, this is part of a way to try and work against the mechanization and to revive a sense of good craftsmanship and raise the status of craft. And so we have some really tremendous things. Art Nouveau became jewelry, it became furniture, it became architecture. It was a style that allowed for this look to permeate all kinds of different arts. And people just gobbled it up. And you can still find it today in many shops. People are still buying this and revering this really wonderful and extravagant look, which is often referred to as arabesque, this wild curving forms. Arabesque simply means Arab-like, meaning it's like the Arab calligraphy in its flowing lines and forms. An illustrator by the name of Aubrey Beardsley was invited by Oscar Wilde, who we talked about earlier, the writer. One of the plays that Oscar Wilde wrote was a tragedy in one act, Salome, and he wrote this play expressly for Sarah Bernhardt. And he creates this drama, this story that Gustave Moreau was so infatuated with. Now is this drama, and it was performed in Paris in the 11th of February, 1896. Oscar Wilde wrote this play in French, and he intended it to be performed in France. He knew that the censorship laws in England were so strict, he would never get it performed. Aubrey Beardsley has this wonderful variation on Art Nouveau, these long, sinuous lines. He brings the symbolism and the eroticism of the knobby art into this new black and white patterning. And he creates these really wonderful, ornate, and exotic shapes and designs that evoke the new style and fashion of the day. So Aubrey Beardsley, like Oscar Wilde, was associated with this homosexual clique and with other English aesthetes. And the details of his sexuality remain in question, but he was generally regarded as asexual. Now we talk about a German symbolist artist who created a series of etchings, and they start out rather mundane in a realistic setting. Here we have this roller skating rink, and this is a series of etchings that Max Klinger made, and he called a glove. And of course, roller skating had become a new fashion, and we can see people trying out these newfangled contraptions and rolling around and falling over as part of this topsy-turvy modern world that people were exploring. And so we see this introduction. We then find this one incident. This man reaches down. He sees a glove on the ground. This woman right in front of him skating off. Did she drop it? His own hat has fallen off, but he's reaching for the glove. And so this is this action, this moment about this glove he finds. And we don't see him returning the glove, or somehow the glove comes into his possession and it starts to become enlarged in his imagination about its significance. He has these fantasies about this glove and the woman who lost it. So this is now this further exploration. We start to see things which are these dreams now, these yearnings. The glove is in each of these compositions. We see the anguished poet. We see this man on the high seas, and the glove is about to sink, and he's reaching for it with this stick. The rescuing of the glove now is taken on this mythic proportions. And then it goes even further. There is the triumph, the return of the glove. Is he imagining how this glove will impact this woman? And you can see this sort of tortured, dreamlike anxieties that the glove is weighing on this person. It's so extravagant, it's seemingly comical when you look at it, but he's really exploring the way in which some object can leap into our imagination. It can start to possess us through our trying to resolve what this object means to us. So then we have this prehistoric flying creature carrying off the glove in this abduction. And lastly, we see the glove limp on the ground and Cupid looking over his arrows off to the side. So there's a sense of symbolism, but again, what does it mean? I think this is where symbolism starts to get really interesting, is that it's pushing the boundaries of meaning. That symbolism does not mean that these things have fixed meanings or that they refer to something in a very specific way. Symbolism means that we're using these symbols to explore mysteries, things that we don't have any words to actually describe. Another very important symbolist artist, Odilon Redon, who was familiar with the post-impressionists. He struggled for a great time trying to find his niche. He began working in lithographs, and it was through this that he begins to really find this vocabulary. His figures are very dark and foreboding with these large, dreamy eyes. Looking up is a symbol for reverie, for inward gaze. And he starts to explore shapes and forms that seem very dream-inspired. And he encourages that by creating a series of pictures called The Dream. And giving his work these dreamy titles. So here we have germination in the dream. And again, a series of images. Again, these floating heads, this ambiguous space, this unfolding in clouds. Odilon Redon really plays with the values of these forms so that they really feel strangely connected, but also isolated. Like, what is the relationship between these heads? What's going on here? Here is one of my personal favorites, this rather strange work. The eye is like a strange balloon, mounts toward infinity. Okay, again, he's really great at coining these titles. And that was one of the things that people found so fascinating about his work, was the poetic quality that he brought to the titling of his work. So during his lifetime, Redon made close to 30 etching and 200 lithographs, working almost exclusively in black and white. His reputation flourished due in part to the availability of his prints. He became a celebrated figure in the fin de siècle Paris, greatly admired by artists and writers of the symbolist movement. And because he shared that enthusiasm, the fantastic, the mystical, and the sublime forces that were working underneath everyday life. Redon would say, "My whole originality therefore consists in making the most implausible beings live human lives according to the laws of the plausible, placing the logic of the visible, insofar as possible, at the service of the invisible." Here, the marsh flower, a head sad and human, with his homage to Goya. Okay, now again, I think he says it's a homage to Goya, but is it really? He was notorious for making illusions without actually having any real intent at making those kinds of connections. So people would look at this and go, Goya, yes, Goya. And it would be not like, well, how is that Goya? I don't know. And so he would make these associations as a way of kind of deepening the mystery of his work. Later in life, and his reputation in black and white was secure, he begins to work in pastels and brilliant colors. And some of this is really just my favorite work. It's so luminous. It's so expressive. The figures are enveloped in these wonderful bursting color fields. So again, deeply engaged with symbolism and symbolic import. He did all kinds of images invoking spiritual experiences and spiritual leaders. Here is a lovely picture he did of his wife, Camille Redon, in a yellow shawl.